Gaspar Yanga headed one of the only known examples of a successful attempt by slaves to negotiate their freedom and have it sanctioned by the King of Spain. He founded the first free settlement in the Americas in 1618. I noticed that there aren't clear where he was born. Here's a source that mentions Angola or Gabon, and they also mentioned an imaginary debate. And here we have Angola again, but more importantly, a renaming process that was done, but not by who, where so-called Africans were given names according to their alleged origins. When I read Yanga was of royal lineage, I was reminded of Juan Garrido, whose African origin was also in doubt. But here, the author imagines that Garrido too was of royal lineage and went to Portugal to become a Christian and learn about Western culture, while at the same time Africans were being enslaved. It seems like the author believes Africans were so enamored with the West they would ignore the possibility of being enslaved, yet Garrido was still double-crossed by the Portuguese and enslaved. Personally, I thought he sounded like he was a Muslim expelled from Spain. However, the idea of a black Spaniard and the Moorish occupation of Spain seems to have been erased from history. So I brought references. In the story of the Moors in Spain, we find out that after the reconquest and the expulsion of Moors, they became prisoners of war and were enslaved. Here we have the aptly named African garrison being enslaved, and poor Muslims being sent to Seville and also enslaved. And in the year 1610, 500,000 Moors were exiled and ruined out of a total of 3 million Moors who were lost to history. In the Jews and the Moors, we read that shortly thereafter, 300,000 so-called black Jews were expelled from Portugal, with ships taking them to Africa, where in 1671 we read that they ended up in Guinea, Angola, and the island of St. Thomas. All right, let's get back to Yanga's story, because here in Africa's Legacy in Mexico, What is a Mexican by Miriam Jimenez Roman, who went to the town of Yanga in Veracruz, she writes, originally known as San Lorenzo de los Negros, in 1932, the town was renamed for its founder, a rebellious Muslim man from what is now Nigeria. In 1609, after resisting capture for 38 years, Yanga negotiated to establish a free black community. So far, so good. However, a comment from one of my viewers on a previous video asks me to read the letter written by a friar sent to meet Yanga. He offered to be a slave catcher for the Spanish crown, and there was no defeat, and Spain only went after him for kidnapping Spanish and native women. Sounds like my viewer thinks the Catholics were defenders of women. So I think the question that is being asked is, was Yanga a traitor? First, the letter. It was actually written by either Yanga or his lieutenant, and I guess they learned how to read and write Spanish while on the run from Spaniards. Here we read the significance of the letter and the subsequent agreement highlight the potential for negotiation and compromise, even in the context of colonial power. I'll have more on the supposed negotiation and compromise later. So to understand what really happened, I had to go to the Spanish sources, so let's check out Yanga and the Resistance in New Spain by Gloria Arjona from the Hispanic Journal. She echoes the sentiment of the viewer as we read, he is a traitor as he ends up persecuting the Maroons in exchange for a modest remuneration from the government. And we also get mention of Queen Njinga, who was from the kingdom alluded to in the Juan Garrido explanation. In his explanation, it was an unnamed African kingdom, and what he left out is that they converted to Catholicism, and the just war pretext allows the enslavements of prisoners of war. So in this case, conversion is a euphemism. Here again, we have the mention of his noble lineage, which I have not been able to verify, but more importantly, we have his date of birth as 1554. Remember, the Muslim expulsion was not complete until 1610. So he was born during the expulsion, and he was brought to Veracruz in 1579 when he was 25 years old. We also read that Spain was on the losing side and that the King of Spain contributed financially to stop Yanga's exploits because his militia controlled the road between the port of Veracruz and Puebla. It also mentions the so-called negotiations where Yanga agreed to the following. They would hand over escaped slaves, they would be relocated to a more accessible area reserved solely for his people, they would also pursue other escaped slaves for a fee, and they would receive a priest. They declared themselves Christians, and Yanga built a town with a population of about 300 people, and this is where the story usually ends, with Yanga's image apparently tarnished due to the conditions of his negotiated freedom. But that is not the end of the story, because in the archives of the Holy Inquisition, there was more information that is included in The 33 Blacks, which recreates a tragedy that occurred in 1612. Here's that book, Los 33 Negros by Vicente Riva Palacio. Good morning, Francisco, said the old man, extending his hand to the other with a paternal air. God keep you, Father Yanga, replied Francisco. What news does my son Francisco de la Matosa bring me? Bad news, Father Yanga, bad news. So what? Have some of our brothers died? No, the whites want our deaths. Yesterday, a brother who is also like me from Angola appeared to me. He left Puebla and told me. Well, what did he tell you? That an expedition is coming against us from Puebla. It's led by a captain from that city named Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera, and it left on the 26th. It's 30 days away, so it must be very close now. I believe so, and that's why I've withdrawn, in order to arrange all the troops and to prepare them for combat. Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera brings 100 Spanish soldiers, 100 adventurers, 150 Indian archers, and nearly 200 more mulattoes, mestizos, and Spaniards who have gathered from the estancias. That is about 550 men. That's a lot of people in truth, and we don't have just as many. He had about 80. But it doesn't matter. God will help. Which way are they coming? Yanga returned. Francisco, he said, it's necessary to write this to Don Pedro Gonzalez. And why? Francisco asked with a surprise. To tell him that we will obey God and the king, but that we want our freedom. That if they grant it to us, if they don't return us to our cruel masters, if they give us a town of our own, we will lay down our arms. Does that seem right to you? Yes, Francisco replied. And who will carry that letter? The Spaniard we have prisoner. An hour later, a Spaniard left the black camp carrying a letter from Yanga, leader of the rebels, to Captain Don Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera. Old Yanga was the spirit of that revolution, which he had meditated on for 30 years, and the black Francisco de la Matosa was the general of arms appointed by Yanga. The blacks were already waiting for the signal for battle. Reading on in Los 33 Negros, we find out exactly what happened to them. It cannot be known for certain whether the audience actually uncovered a conspiracy or whether it intended to calm the spirits and intimidate the blacks with a loud example, in case they were considering rebelling. What is certain is that barely after Easter, Mexico witnessed one of the most horrific executions in living memory. 29 black men and 4 black women were executed on the same day and at the same time in the city's main square. The crowd was immense. The square and streets, balconies and rooftops, everything was packed. Spectators were everywhere, and the horrific massacre could be seen from all sides. The scene was capable of making even Nero shudder with horror. Those men, and especially those women, walking to the gallows, almost dying, covered in rags to find death after a life of slavery and suffering. The confessors, with a loud cry, commended those souls to God's mercy. An immense crowd churned like a stormy sea, and above all those heads, 33 gallows from which 33 corpses hung an hour later. The execution was over, but the people didn't leave, and there was still a second, more repugnant act to come. The executioners began to take down the corpses and, with an axe, cut off their heads, which were attached to spikes. Corpses were being punished, and the rotten blood of the dead was being shed. That scene was disgusting. The 33 heads were placed on spikes in the city's main square, and an ornament worthy of the grandeur of the governing audience. Those trophies of civilization remained there for a long time until the audience realized that the stench could no longer be endured and ordered them removed and buried. Thus, that dreamed of conspiracy was stifled in the year 1612. The authorities ordered the murder of Yanga and Francisco de la Matosa for sheltering runaway slaves. Yanga's murder reaffirmed his unconditional dedication to the cause of the enslaved, placing him as one of the greatest historical rebels in Mexico who would lay the groundwork for the abolition of slavery. It's key to remember that Yanga was killed by the authorities just 3 years after signing this pact, precisely because he failed to comply by handing over the Maroons. So that's the full story: birth, life, and death. And to be honest, I actually like the Disney version where everyone lived happily ever after. But what do you think? Is Yanga one of the greatest historical rebels in Mexico, or a traitor? Let me know in the comments what you think, and thanks for watching.